Holy shit, so unprofessional. Alright, there, I think it's good. Welcome, another video. What I wanted to talk about in this video is basically like how I was very close with having my first book flop fully, because I haven't obviously published anything. I'm still working on my first draft. It's going to be a hell of a fucking messy one, and I basically this week I began reading a book called Fantasy Fiction Formula, and I learned that basically my protagonist and antagonist, which are always supposed to be in conflict, right? I learned that my antagonist was really very, very passive, and that's what I wanted to talk about today. Basically how story structure and learning narrative is rather important. I have believed for the last year that if I just draft away, if I just write, I'll eventually figure out all of this stuff. But well, now after realizing that if I just continued without reading Fantasy Fiction Formula, I haven't read the full book. But if I hadn't read the part where it was about, was it? Give me 1 second. Fucking, I was so prepared. What was it? Yeah, so it was basically the first chapter called Formulating a Story Plan, and when the protagonist is heading out on their journey, they always have to have this opposing force, the antagonist, that is pushing them back and trying to basically the antagonist is being the force, is pushing at the protagonist, and that force and adversity for the protagonist is what's going to make the person grow, going to make the person eventually change. And that's what all stories are for, as I've seen, that there's always going to have to be this change at the end. And I realized that my antagonist, he's called Garrick Aldrich, and he's literally imprisoned in the first entire book. He wasn't a very proactive antagonist. He was a very passive one, right? And he was basically non-existent, right, for my protagonist. And that would have fucked everything up. Everything. But luckily I began reading this fantasy fiction formula by Deborah Chester, and I realized that, oh shit, my antagonist is actually not doing anything at Roman Peterson, which is my protagonist. And well, the solution was basically to try figure out ways to make him more active. And that's what I've been doing this past week. Also made some changes to my writing schedule, as fuck, there's you always figure out new things about how you like to work, etc. I also personally began asking myself this question. I literally put it up on my wall, which is, what does the book series need? And I try to follow that more closely. And I realized that after I read this chapter, Formulating a Story Plan, that I needed more structure. I need more, when there's a full series you're going to make, perhaps it's very smart to at least know your plot points and make sure all of the different elements, and there's a lot of fucking elements. When I've been reading this book, half the time I've been hella confused and I have no idea what the fuck to do, right? But again, you just have to take one step at a time. So after I read Formulating a Story Plan, which basically is that, I'll tell you mine. I'll read it up to you actually, because I wrote it into the Scrivener project where I keep my entire series. Let's do it. So a story plan basically consists of, 5 different elements. It's situation, protagonist, objective, opponent, and climax. So as I wrote my story plot for, this is book 1 specifically of my 6-book series, I wrote it like this. When he is forcibly taken from England to a hidden warrior school in the Norwegian mountains, that's the situation. Roman Peterson, the protagonist, desperate to escape his implied duty and to return to his quiet English life, begins looking for a way out. But can he stop running when the school's most dangerous prisoner starts hunting him from the shadows, manipulating those closest to him into betraying him? Garrick Aldrich, the antagonist, who needs Ronan's blood to break free, and once free will stop at nothing to destroy the boy, standing between him and burning Northwatch to the ground. That is basically my story plan. Situation is that Roman Peterson is taken forcibly from his home to this warrior school deeply buried in Norway's mountain regions. And he doesn't want to be there. He has no absolute desire to be at that warrior school because he's been used to all of this like comfort seeking, right? Playing Fortnite, being in this modern world, because this story will take place in 2025, right? And he doesn't want to be there because it's tough, it's hard, and it has a very it's very tough for him because he has a misbelief. He doesn't believe that he can change. He doesn't believe that he can actually, through discipline and adversity, grow into someone else, grow into a new, better person that he can respect more. He doesn't believe in that stuff. And when I didn't have like this, when my antagonist was very passive and he was just imprisoned down below, beneath the school. I know this is a full-on fucking rant, but just stick with me, hopefully. And when my antagonist was beneath the school, because he's imprisoned below Northwatch, which is the warrior school, he was very passive. He was just there, right? And the real antagonist, like when I didn't make my antagonist start hunting him from the shadows, immediately making him more active, basically the warrior school itself was the antagonist towards my protagonist, Roman Peterson. And that would have flopped the entire book 1. It would have fucking killed it and tossed it into the fucking bin, right? So I'm very glad I began reading fantasy fiction formula. I think it's slightly underrated to read books on fiction. I personally thought like, oh, why the fuck would I do that, right? Like, I can't be reading about the craft. I gotta be doing the craft and writing, right? I have to draft. I have to build my characters. Why the fuck do I need to read about building a character, right? But I realized that reading a book on fantasy fiction, for example, and just writing in general, it's like taking advice from a mentor. And you can take that advice and you can have it in your mind when you go ahead and draft. I think the main thing is that just don't let the fantasy fiction craft, like study, reading all the books, get in the way of actually writing something, actually continuing your story. I personally, God, give me one second. So I began this new routine. Like I'm literally starting a new routine every fucking day, right? And it literally says, I start off with outline, just plot structure. And that is because that is the most important thing right now for the book series. Since it's a 6-book series, I need to have like these plot points put out. I need to have this big structure, and I need to have the knowledge of where is it actually going to go, right? Then after I've like sort of gotten into the world that way, I begin drafting. I begin drafting scenes, and I begin basically to just make sure my writing is improving as well. I personally don't like the idea of ending up with like spending an entire day only world building, outlining structure, right? I feel like the real fun thing is to actually draft itself, right? And actually create the thing, create the masterpiece. So that's yeah. After I've drafted, I do world building / character building based on what the story needs, right? I don't want to world build unnecessary things. I want to put the necessary thing in place so the story can actually become a story and actually eventually get finished. Then, as for like craft study, I've put this in as like basically my like third or like fourth block in the day, and that's after I've had breakfast, etc. I started like, okay, let me read some storycraft, let me learn something about this, and then I suddenly get a new like, oh shit, like I didn't know dialogue could be done that way, for example, and that also like feeds into what I'm just reading in general. I actually start having this, oh, like this writer's eye everyone's talking about, and I can see more clearly, oh shit, I know why, let's say in dialogue, when you change who is talking, you might start a new paragraph. I didn't know that previously, and that's something I learned in the fantasy fiction formula book, and I find that very helpful, and I find it very cool as well. You feel more like a writer when you, for example, that's another thing I did. You feel more like a writer when you go through a book. I went a little bit like through this, and you just see things. You see the dialogue, you see the conflict building, the tension, and I find it very fun in my experience. A little sick today. I'm gonna push through. Let's fucking go. So yeah, I also like for this day, for like this week, I also did chapter. I worked very hard on like chapter 3. I've in my outline and like plot structure sessions, I find it more and more important to just do this, like to learn about to study craft because I feel like it feeds into all of the different like elements, the different activities that I do for my book series. So outlining and structure. When I've read a little bit about outline and structure, for example, I've read a little bit about scene structure, and if I'm remembering correctly, I think there's a difference between a scene from a movie and there's a difference between a scene from a book. A scene from a book is more like dialogue. That's when like the real scene is happening. There's tension between two characters, etc. And then you have like description. I might be completely wrong here, but like a scene is different from being in a book and from being in a movie. In a movie, I believe it's more there's like when is it happening, where is it happening, and when the location and when it's happening changes, it's a new scene. So just getting more clarity on how a book series or a book is just generally composed and what kind of elements it's composed of and how those elements look like and how they sort of what their dynamic with each other is, because that's something Deborah taught me, that a book is basically just a dance between all of these different elements. It's a dance between all the elements, and you have to make them like dance right together. Holy fuck, what an absolute killer analogy. And yeah, and also when you're writing a story, like in my personal experience, I actually find it very fun to read about the different elements. It feels very productive, even though the most productive thing I can do is to write, but it feeds the writing as well as like when you read about character design, it feeds how you build characters and all of these. You basically improve all of the elements more deliberately. You don't just like randomly create a character out of the oblivion, right? The character might be like completely fucked and bollocks and yeah, fucking hell, bro. It might be complete like terrible. And when you read about character design, when you're creating the next time, you might get some, oh, this question is very good to interview this character with. This is a great thing to add in. And then you suddenly end up creating a better character because you have more like knowledge around character building to pull out from. And Deborah here has, I think she has written like 40 plus novels. So just taking advice from people who've done really fucking well in writing and using that for yourself to deliberately improve what you want to write. I think that's so nice. Very nice. And that's something I actually wish I'd done previously before, because I've throughout this like entire year, I talked about in the last video that I've done 12 months now fantasy fiction. And yeah, another thing I wish I'd done is I'd read more fiction, craft things, and just start learning about all of these things and all of these elements. There's a lot of elements I've just had no idea even existed. And yeah, like behind every successful story, behind every good story, there's always a structure. There's always an author who understands these elements, right? George R. Martin, even though he might be a gardener or like he likes to not spoil the entire thing and he likes to discover it, he has an internal like knowledge, an internal wisdom about these different elements because he's worked in television and yeah, he's read a lot of books, and over time he's just grasped this like story narrative thing, right? This story structure. But as for someone who begins like me, I'm completely oblivion to all of the different elements. And also I haven't read a lot of books. I have not read a lot of books at fucking all. And yeah, I didn't read heavily in my childhood. So I think it's even more important for me to actually, okay, let me head right into the fucking source and look at these different elements. What the fuck are they? How do they work together? Yeah. So that's basically the video. Gonna end it there. No, drag it out. Reading, fiction, craft, study things. Doing that after you've actually done the most important thing, which is drafting. I think that's a good strategy. And yeah, if I were to give you an action step, I'd say fucking buy the fantasy fiction formula. I'm not an affiliate. You know how small my channel is right now. So, you know, I'm not getting anything from this. But I think it's a very, very like educational book. So, with that said, take care. Have a good weekend.